floats somewhere between the realm of coastal oceanography, mycology, and sustainability assessment. In the presentation today, Flo will take you on her personal journey towards sustainable future thinking. She'll talk about harnessing a resource that is usually treated as waste and turning it into a sustainable food enterprise.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. When I was a kid, I played this game that I made up with my little sister, and we called it What If. So I'd make up some fantastic disaster, like, what if an asteroid hit the school this morning and we couldn't go? And then she'd say something like, then we'd have to go to another school. And then I'd say, well, what if an asteroid hit all the schools? And she'd say, well, then we'd have to stay home. So that'd go on, basically, until someone gave up or the world was annihilated. What if the world was facing a climate disaster? Then we would have to design for a sustainable future. And that's what drives me, the belief that I can contribute to that sustainable future. I believe that we need to move away from the meat industry. It's a huge contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to lead a more plant-based lifestyle. The media is screaming this at us. In Australia, livestock emissions account for about 70% of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and that's 11% of the total national greenhouse gas emissions. It makes Australia's livestock the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after energy and transport. And that's not even touching on the land and water degradation that results from farming cattle. So that belief in plant-based sustainable future led me to start a business in 2019. I called it Made with Love by Flo, and as far as I know, it was Perth's first fully plant-based, plastic-free catering, and it had a focus on sustainability. And it was a huge success, because for a time, it was my personal contribution to the sustainable future that I envisaged. Then at the start of 2020, we moved to Bunbury, and I closed my business. I thought I might start the business up again in the southwest once we settled in and unpacked the boxes. Then COVID happened, and we've got 3 kids. So I wasn't just feeding them and bundling them off to school. All of a sudden, I was deemed qualified to teach them. So quarantine forced me to stop and think, possibly a little bit too much time to think. I'd spent a year run off my feet, catering and posting plant-based recipes online and finding genius ways of serving sauces not in plastic containers. I did all the things everyone did, the sourdough and starting a veggie patch, all with limited success. And we weren't familiar with the southwest, so we started to explore. And we did many, many beautiful walks and rides, some along the Bunbury track, sometimes the gorgeous estuary with the dolphins and the big swamp, and often the beaches. So one day we drove toward Busselton and we went to explore the beaches there, and we came across this beach that was completely covered in seagrass wrack. We couldn't see the water at all. You had to climb right to the top of the wrack to actually see the water. The kids loved it. They were just about snowboarding down this wrack. What if there was a mountain of nuisance seagrass wrack sitting on a beautiful beach? Then the council would organise trucks and diggers and move it to another beach. But what if that isn't sustainable? And there's better solutions for wrack. The earth has put energy from the sun and nutrients from the ocean to grow that seagrass before it washed up on the beach. Yet here we are using even more energy, fossil fuels, to move it. Isn't that ridiculous? And the reason so much wrack accumulates and is trapped there on the beaches is because of our coastal developments. The obstructions stop the wrack from moving as it should seasonally. So what can you do with wrack? I started to think about it as a resource rather than a waste. In other states in Australia, there's various industries converting excess wrack into fertilisers, soil improvers, stock and mariculture feeds, alginates, agars. And in the Baltic, they use it for composting and biocoal, landfill cover, bioenergy production, and again, fertiliser production. So here's where the story gets interesting. Because when I saw that mountain of wrack, I thought mushrooms. I know, that's a bit weird, and I do sound like a mad scientist when I say that, but that's what happens when you're looking for the what-if questions through the lens of sustainability. I wondered whether I could grow oyster mushrooms on the seagrass wrack and ultimately turn it into food and compost for agriculture. It's not really as far-fetched as you think, because, as we just said, places internationally are already composting it through bioremediation, just the usual way. This is just another means of composting it, except to get mushrooms to eat along the way. So, looking at those piles of wrack, they brought to mind the idea of mycoremediation, and one of my favourite mushroom gurus, who's Paul Stamets, his belief in fungi as the hero of bioremediation is absolutely inspiring. And if you haven't already seen his talk online, his TED talk, I highly recommend you do. One of his experiments involved taking a load of oil-contaminated soil and inoculating it with oyster mushroom spawn. He covered it and then left it side by side with other piles of untreated contaminated soil. So in 16 weeks, the soil was covered in oyster mushrooms. And they were feeding on the oil, and the toxicity had reduced enough to allow for plants and worms and insects and birds and other species to inhabit, while the control piles remain toxic to the biota. So yes, this is amazing, but mushrooms are amazing. And Paul continued that research into what oyster mushrooms could do for oil spills, and his team came up with a myco-boom. See, oyster mushrooms are tolerant to salt water. So they created this porous bag and they filled it with the inoculated straw, and then they allowed it to sit there in the contaminated water and soak up the oil. So as a result, it reduced the toxicity and it made mushrooms. You can't eat those mushrooms because they're full of toxins, but it is a way of remediating some of the mess we make as humans. So I decided to try my idea out. Can we grow oyster mushrooms on seagrass wrack? I'll just explain a little bit about how oyster mushrooms are usually grown, but I won't go into too much detail. We can leave that for the questions. You need to add the spawn to the substrate. So basically the spawn is the starter. The spawn is the starter, a bit like a seedling if you're talking in plants. The substrate is whatever material that you're going to grow the mushrooms on. So most people use straw that they sterilise or pasteurise, getting rid of any other competing bacteria or anything. Next, the straw is put in bags and sometimes in reusable buckets, and that's kept in a dark and warm environment because it simulates it being underground in the summer. And then you wait until the entire substrate's been colonised or taken over by the mycelium, and that's kind of like the root of the mushroom, and it looks completely white like in those bags there. Then when it's fully colonised, the bag or the bucket is put in a humid environment with fresh air that mimics autumn. So like when there's the cooler weathers start and there's a bit of rain. So because fungi, they actually breathe oxygen like us. They're more like an animal than a plant. And so they need that fresh air. It's then that you see the mushrooms pinning out of the holes and fruiting and growing rapidly into harvestable mushrooms. Okay. So this is my low-tech setup. I deliberately did not use high-tech equipment because I wanted this to be something that anybody can do. First is the incubation chamber. It's an esky with a hot water bottle. I did say it was low-tech. So that's where I put the substrate with the spawn in to incubate and then take over the substrate, so to colonise it. And I keep that at, it's about 25 to 35 degrees. I mean, it fluctuates because, it's low-tech. And that's okay. It's already proven to be okay to do that. Here's the fruiting chamber. It's actually just a greenhouse from Bunnings. I cut a hole in the side where the window is, and I've stuck a little fan in there. So that brings in the fresh air that the mushrooms need. And there's the humidifier. They're just little ones from eBay in a bucket of water. So that keeps it over 80% humidity. And unfortunately, the air temperature in the fruiting chamber is ambient air temperature. So sometimes it gets a little bit too cold, like the last couple of weeks have been very cold, and they don't really like that, so the growth slows down. But when it warms up, they grow a lot faster. And there's just a little sensor I got from Bunnings, and it shows me the temperature and humidity, so I can keep an eye on it. So what actually ended up happening? Well, keep in mind, I didn't sterilise or pasteurise. I didn't even wash the seagrass rack. I just put it in there with the spawn in the buckets. And that's important because normally when you grow mushrooms on straw, you have to do those things or you end up with a big green mess. I think the reason why I didn't need to sterilise, why nothing grew other than the mushrooms, is because it's probably because it's salty and it's inhibiting anything else from growing. So, but the oyster mushrooms don't mind the salt. So they colonise that bucket in 2 weeks. It is a small bucket because I want to repeat this experiment a few times during my project. So then 2 weeks later, the mushrooms started pinning and fruiting. And I really like this picture, but I'm a bit of a nerd. I just think this is awesome. There's mushrooms growing on seagrass rack. And there's the mushrooms when they're fully ready to harvest off seagrass rack. So the picture on the left, that's a larger bucket, that's a 20-litre bucket. And that took a long while to colonise, but I did that last year. And then the ones on the right are the ones that I'm doing right now. So I brought one in for show and tell. I'll bring it out in a minute. So this is definitely faster than growing a cow. And it's actually a lot faster than growing the food for a cow as well. So where to now? Well, firstly, I'm completing this graduate degree in environmental management. So as part of that, I'm doing this sustainability assessment to work out where it sits in terms of environmental, economic and social sustainability. I'm using various criteria based on other sustainability assessments, and I'm doing this with the help of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 were adopted by all the UN member states in 2015 as an agenda for sustainable development of the people and planet now and into the future. It calls for action to end poverty and reduce inequality, improve health and education, and take action on climate change. So they're a good starting point when assessing sustainability. And I've chosen 8 of those 17 goals to focus on more closely in relation to my sustainability assessment. It's also important to look at the venture from a life cycle point of view, and that's been done by various studies as well. Like this one is an urban mushroom farm that growing on straw. And incidentally, there are a couple of researchers that did manage to grow oyster mushrooms successfully on beach wrack in India, but they did their experiment following these methods for straw. So they sterilised it, they used a lot of water, and they grew it in bags. So if we ask the same life cycle assessment questions of our setup, like is there less processing of the substrate required if seagrass wrack is used instead of straw? Is it more sustainable because it doesn't require sterilisation or very little water? And are buckets better than using disposable plastic bags for growing the mushrooms? And so on. So ultimately, I'd like to experiment a bit with the spent wrack, so when it's all used up and the mushrooms have fruited on it, and try planting some seedlings in there and see how that goes. I want to know if the mushroom wrack is beneficial to plants. Is it useful maybe for areas where the soil is nutrient depleted and maybe not suitable for agriculture? And so go forth, follow your passion, experiment and be a mad scientist, and discover some new things. Thank you.